It's been known for some time now that the Gamecocks needed some help at the edge rusher position, and they're getting that and more in Syracuse transfer JDS Gear.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, your show for the latest headlines and potential storylines on South Carolina Gamecock athletics. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank you for making Locked On Gamecocks your first watch or listen here today. We are free and available on YouTube and also wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. The South Carolina Gamecocks got decimated at the edge rusher position this offseason. Obviously, the Gamecocks had a couple of surprise portal defections take place, with guys like Gilber, Edmund going to Florida State and Jordan Burch going all the way out to Oregon in the Pac-12. Hot Rod Fenton was another guy that hit the transfer portal after it seemed like that he just wasn't going to be able to carve out some playing time for himself here in Columbia. You throw in some legal troubles for Monteque Rhames and an ACL tear for Jordan Stratton from back in week 2 of 2022, and the Gamecocks had a lot of issues with depth at this spot in spring practice, and this was definitely a position of need for South Carolina. So Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks went out into the portal, and they identified and have now landed a target in Syracuse transfer JDS Gear, who, while productive at Syracuse last fall, is a guy with untapped potential that could be unlocked at South Carolina. JDS Gear had a pretty solid stat line in his redshirt freshman season this past fall, as he recorded 33 total tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, and 3.5 sacks. And I went back and watched one of his games at Syracuse this past season, and I found 4 different things that I liked from JDS Gear. The first thing that stood out to me is the explosive twitch that Gear possesses. He's got great get-off when it comes to his pass rush, and surprisingly was really good at mucking things up on the interior for the opposing offensive line, specifically when he used his dip and rip move against a guard or an offensive tackle. And when it comes to being able to showcase JDS Gear's athleticism the best at South Carolina, I think that it could be best utilized in stunt moves, which involves basically a couple defensive linemen taking a different gap than the one that they're originally lined up at. So for JDS Gear, if he's lined up on the outside of an offensive tackle, you might actually see him go to the outside or inside half of the offensive guard on the same side that he's already lined up on. So it's nothing too complicated. But when it comes to guys that possess the explosiveness that JDS Gear has, stunt moves are usually the best way to see that in full force. Another thing that I like about JDS Gear is he's a smart football player who does the little things right on defense. JDS Gear, in my opinion, does a really good job in setting the edge in rush defense, despite being listed at only 233 pounds this past season. And in my opinion, the biggest reason why he was good at setting the edge in rush defense is due to his great recognition skills when it comes to down blocks, where the offensive tackle goes straight for a linebacker, and reach blocks, where basically his guy tries to get to his outside half so that he can seal him off and allow the opposing running back to go out to the edge scot-free. He's pretty good at seeing what the offensive lineman is going to do in short order, to where he's not working from behind in the middle of running plays. The other thing is, if JDS Gear is trying to pursue a ball carrier, he takes fantastic angles. Something that, while might surprise some of you, is sometimes one of the biggest challenges for defenders, especially when playing in the heat of a moment during a football game. The other thing that Gamecock fans are going to love about JDS Gear is the fact that he has got a very high motor. This guy does not take plays off. He gives it 100% every single play in a game. This is not somebody that you're going to be sitting there and saying that he is loafing on this play on one drive and a couple plays on this drive. You're not going to see that with Jatius Geer. And that's really commendable for Jatius Geer, because when it comes to playing defensive line, sometimes it's easy to just sit there and say, you know something, we're on like an 8-play drive right now. I'm gassed. I'm just going to take this play off, and I'm going to hope that my 10 teammates around me are going to make a play. JDS Gear does not have that mentality, and I think that his teammates are going to love him because of that. The last thing that I liked about JDS Gear relates to the scheme, and mainly the fact that Syracuse ran a multiple front defense. So he lined up in a bunch of different sets and formations, so that makes him more versatile when it comes to trying to learn Clayton White's defense and the formations that he might run in his scheme here in Columbia. Now, while there's multiple things I like about Jatius Geer and his game, there are a couple things that I think he could improve upon at South Carolina. The first one being his leverage and hand movement when engaged with blockers. There was a lot of times when watching the Syracuse and Florida State game from last year where it seemed like to me that Jatius Geer was attacking blockers almost like he was a linebacker, where he sort of will entertain attacking them and he'll put his hands on them and whatnot, but he seems to hope that he can kind of effort his way to the quarterback or to the ball carrier that he's chasing after. And so I think that Sterling Lucas is going to have to work on developing some pass rushing moves where he's got a lot more hand movement, because he's got the explosiveness in his lower body. You have to assume that the same could be the case in his upper body as well if he works on that. The other thing which cannot be coached up is his size. He's got the 6'6" frame, which is certainly something that the coaching staff's going to like. But Jatius Geer is only 233 pounds, again, based on his player profile at Syracuse. So he's going to need to pack on some good weight once he arrives at South Carolina over the summer. So all in all, when looking at Jatius Geer, he's got the athleticism, he has got the perceivable work ethic, and he's also got the know-how, the football IQ to be a quality starter for South Carolina's defensive line. The main thing with him is he's just going to need a little bit of time to refine his technique under his new position coach in Sterling Lucas. But this guy is definitely going to make an impact, and in my opinion, while he was productive last season at Syracuse, he's got a lot more left in the tank, a lot more that can be brought out of him now that he is at Columbia under an SEC coaching staff. Now, Jatius Geer, he definitely is going to make an impact, as I just mentioned, for the Gamecocks this next season. But where could he be slotted in the depth chart? And what does his arrival mean for other guys in South Carolina's defensive line room? I'm going to dive into all that in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. But first, today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Built Bar. Built Bar is one of the best protein bars that you could possibly get on the open market right now. Built Bar has got everything that you could possibly want. First of all, it is low in calories. It's not going to take 300 calories out of your daily allotment. It still gives you all the protein you need, 17 grams, despite being only 130 calories, and it's also low in sugar. But these bars are also tasty. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. They got a variety of flavors to choose from. And here's the other thing. If you don't want to order Built Bar at Built.com and you want to get these bars right away, you can drive to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and go get yourself a box. At Walmart, you can find these Built Bars in the pharmacy section where you can grab yourself a 4-bar box. At Sam's Club, you can buy in bulk and grab a 13-bar box. I promise you, you're going to thank me later once you try Built Bar, because Built is where tasty is the new healthy. Welcome back to this Friday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And thank you once again to all of you everydayers for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily listen or watch when it comes to South Carolina Gamecock sports. Now, let's talk about Jatius Geer and his potential fit on the depth chart. The way I see it right now, I think that Geer is the second string edge rusher on the defensive line, but that could be completely dependent on Jordan Straughn's recovery from his ACL tear that he suffered again early on this past season. Straughn obviously was making good progress when the media talked to Shane Beamer throughout spring practice, and while he did not really fully participate in a lot of the drills for South Carolina's spring ball, it's definitely clear that he's going to be back on the field by the time the season begins. But as we've talked about before with ACL tears, you cannot make an easy conclusion as to how Jordan Straughn is going to return from this injury. He has had one apparently before, so you could make the argument that now that he knows what he's got to go through in terms of rehabbing and recovering both physically and mentally, that it won't take him long to bounce back. But you could also say that it also wears on his mind mentally because he's sitting there thinking, I'm going through this all over again. It is very hard to rehab from any kind of surgery, much less one on your knee that requires about 7, 8 to 9 months of rehab. So if Jordan Straughn is all the way back, then JDS Gear is probably your second string edge rusher. If he's not all the way back, if he needs to sort of work his way back on into that starting lineup, then JDS Gear, he could be the starter for the Gamecocks at this spot in week 1. I will say there's no doubt in my mind that JDS Gear is a guy that belongs at that special edge rusher position in Clayton White's defense, not the weak side defensive end position, where likely he would have to be a much better run defender, at least consistently, in order to be on that spot. But with the explosive quick twitch he has that I talked about earlier, he belongs on that special pass rushing side of the defensive line. Now, when talking about the other guys in this defensive end group, the addition of JDS Gear for South Carolina is going to have indirect benefits for multiple other players in this group, starting off with Desmond Umeozulu, who admittedly for a while looked like a guy that South Carolina was going to have to heavily rely on, not just put in there as part of like the rotation where he gets like 20 snaps. No, a guy that might potentially have to start. And who knows, maybe it doesn't change drastically with JDS Gear's arrival, but I do think that with Gear coming to Columbia, a guy that's going to his 3rd season of college football, and a guy that has played at the Power 5 level, Desmond Umeozulu is not going to have to be forced now to play significant snaps at the very beginning of the 2023 season. And this is going to help him take more time to adjust to the college game, to adjust to these opposing offenses that he's going to be facing, and it's going to take some of the pressure off of him, which can only benefit the true freshman out of the DMV region. Bryan Thomas Jr. is another guy that's going to receive benefit from JDS Gear's arrival here. And the reason why I say that is I think that JDS Gear playing that specialized edge rusher position in Clayton White's defense would offer this coaching staff more flexibility to where they could move Bryan Thomas Jr. to the opposite side of this defensive line. Now, some might disagree with me here, and they might say even that Bryan Thomas Jr. still needs to have a much bigger frame before he plays more of that other defensive end spot. But in my opinion, watching the spring game and Bryan Thomas Jr.'s performance that night, he changed my opinion on him a great deal. I know it was just a spring game, and again, you might say I'm taking too much away from that intra-squad scrimmage between the Gamecocks offense and defense, but I think that Bryan Thomas Jr. showed that he is capable of being a guy that can be effective in rush defense, whereas before, I admittedly felt like Bryan Thomas Jr. was more of a specialized pass rusher that you send on the field on a 2nd and long or 3rd and long obvious passing situation. I don't feel that way anymore. So if the coaches feel the same way, then you could see where Bryan Thomas Jr. now might be able to play more weak side defensive end because JDS Gear, again, likely is going to be in that specialized edge rusher position. Now, the other thing that JDS Gear's addition is going to do is it is going to lessen the need for some of these interior defensive linemen, and I'm talking guys like Tonka Hemingway, Elijah Davis, and TJ Sanders. These guys will not maybe have to now step out to that edge position as much as maybe they were asked to in spring ball and play some snaps there. Even guys like a Donovan Westmoreland from the linebacker room or a Jerron Willis. Those guys now, they're not maybe going to have to go there as often because now you've got another, again, proven productive player at the Power 5 level now in your program in Jatius Geer. Make no mistake about it. I'm not saying that JDS Gear is going to be some sort of superstar as soon as this next season begins for South Carolina. But I really do think that Gear has a ton of potential that he offers here. I think he's a guy that with some time under Sterling Lucas could be a great case study in terms of how good Sterling Lucas is in terms of the development side of things. We know Sterling Lucas can recruit the heck out of high school prospects. But now he's got multiple younger players, guys with a lot of years of eligibility remaining in JDS Gear and Desmond Umeozulu, guys that he could take multiple years to mold and refine in terms of their technique. JDS Gear is going to not only help out this edge rusher group, but he's going to help out other individuals in their own unique way because of the mere fact that he is now going to be a South Carolina Gamecock this upcoming fall. And that is a good thing for Shane Beamer, Clayton White, and the rest of this defensive coaching staff. Alrighty, now to cap off this Friday edition of Locked On Gamecocks, let's discuss the injury situation for South Carolina's baseball team as they head into another tough road series in SEC play as they travel to Fayetteville, Arkansas to take on the Arkansas Razorbacks. Now, South Carolina, for the most part, has been dealing with a lot of injuries in terms of their infield this year. But the injury bug has now infiltrated the pitching staff a lot more, as it was pointed out by Mark Kingston on Thursday afternoon in his press conference that both Noah Hall and Will Sanders will not make the trip to Fayetteville. And apparently Will Sanders has a slight lower body injury that has been somewhat lingering over the past few weeks or so. And I guess it may have gotten to the point where the coaching staff just doesn't feel like that it's worth taking Will Sanders on the trip to Arkansas. Because of that, the starting rotation is now going to be Eli Jones pitching on Friday night, to be announced, or TBA, for Saturday, and Matthew Becker on Sunday. And Jack Mahoney is apparently going to be more of a swing man where they might take him out of the bullpen or he might still start on Saturday. And the coaching staff, it seems like, is going to play it by ear based on how the series is unfolding. I will say this, if there's one player I probably would not start in that Saturday slot, it would probably be James Hicks. And I say that because James Hicks, he's from the state of Arkansas. He grew up watching Arkansas baseball, and so this is going to be kind of like a homecoming for him. I'm sure he's going to have family and friends that are going to be in attendance for this series to watch him play, and obviously, as great as that is for him, I think you do have to worry about that homecoming factor affecting James Hicks' psyche, because James Hicks has already admittedly not had the greatest appearances the last few times he's been out there on the mound for South Carolina. Admittedly, you could say that with a lot of the pitching staff at this current moment. But I don't think that this would be the best weekend to put James Hicks in that starting rotation. If anything, I would probably still say that Jack Mahoney should be that guy on Saturday. But again, obviously you do have a lot of arms in your bullpen, so they could also go bullpen by committee depending on how Eli Jones does on Friday. Jones has shown before that he can go a little ways into a ball game. He can throw 60-plus pitches. So if you're South Carolina, you're probably hoping that Eli Jones, assuming that he's not going to just play the first inning, is going to go 3 to 4 innings on Friday night. And best case, maybe even can go through 5 innings if he can be effective on the mound and get through the Razorbacks lineup quickly. Now, Eli Jersenbeck, he's also not going to make the trip, so that's going to be a blow to South Carolina's bullpen. One less quality arm that will be able to go out there for them this weekend. Chris Veach, however, will be available this weekend after he was dealing with some arm soreness this previous weekend for the Kentucky Wildcats series, which is why he did not make any appearances in that 3-game stretch. In terms of the infield, again, the area that's been decimated the most by injuries this season for South Carolina, it seems like that the Gamecocks are turning a corner here. Second baseman Will McGillis and shortstop Braylon Wimmer are both going to make the trip to Fayetteville, and the staff is hopeful that both of these guys will be available to play in some sort of capacity this weekend. So what that might mean is Will McGillis, he might be playing DH. Maybe Braylon Wimmer also plays some DH, depending on sort of how they feel about the matchups. And maybe Braylon Wimmer's a guy that could play in the field. Will McGillis, again, recovering from a broken bone in his arm. Don't think you want to mess with that too much just quite yet. Talmadge LeCroy at third base. He started against North Florida on Tuesday evening, felt pretty good after that start, and is apparently now good to go and is going to be back in the lineup for South Carolina. I can't emphasize how much that is a big deal for the Gamecocks because Cole Messina has been playing third base for the last several games. Clearly, that is not his primary position. This means that now Cole Messina can come back to catcher. Jonathan French can get a much-needed reprieve because he's gone from catching 1 out of every 7 games to he caught the last 6, 7, 8 games in a row. So you got to imagine that French is feeling it in his lower body, so he could get some much-needed rest this upcoming weekend. And Michael Braswell can be potentially moved over to second to fill in for Will Tippett if he's still feeling a little bit with his arm, although he will be making the trip to Fayetteville as well. Or you could see him potentially move over to shortstop if Will McGillis can actually play in the field this weekend. There's a multitude of things they can do, but the bottom line is Talmadge LeCroy coming back is huge for South Carolina because Messina now can go back to his primary position at catcher and probably will help out the pitching staff a little bit in terms of feeling more comfortable with who they're throwing the ball to. So, it's getting better for the Gamecocks in the field, but in terms of the pitching staff, it seems like now the injuries are piling up there as well. In terms of, do the Gamecocks need this series this weekend? Honestly, I would say yes. I think that for South Carolina, you've already lost 3 out of your last 4 conference series. You've now seemingly, at least for the moment, fallen out of the discussion for a top 8 national seed, which would mean that if you went to the regionals and you won the first round, so to speak, I guess, and moved on to the super regionals, you would not have home field advantage, which again, would be something the Gamecocks could desperately use if they're able to make it that far in the postseason. So, with all of that bearing in mind, I do think that you need to win this weekend. And the other thing is, Arkansas is a very good team, good coach in Dave Van Horn. It's going to be a tough road environment. But the Razorbacks are also dealing with their share of injuries as well. So, both teams are a little bit snake bit in that aspect. It could come down to who's got the better depth on their roster. I still feel like South Carolina's depth is pretty good. With Comasina back behind the plate, I do think you'll see those pitchers feel a little bit better knowing that he's now again back there, and no offense to Jonathan French. And you've got one of your primary infielders back in Talmadge LeCroy, who is going to help you in terms of getting on base because he draws a lot of walks, and also bring a pretty good fielder when he's not having to play on dadgum AstroTurf. So, I think South Carolina can win this series, but it's all going to hinge on how this pitching staff performs admittedly. If Eli Jones ends up getting knocked out of game 1 within the first inning or 2, that could literally set the Gamecocks back for the entire rest of the series. So, can't emphasize enough, Eli Jones, he might be the most important player for this team heading into this 3-game stretch against Arkansas. He has stepped up in big moments before. This might be the biggest moment, however, for Eli Jones in his young career at South Carolina. We'll see how he handles it once this series gets underway later on this evening. With that being said, y'all, that's going to do it for today's show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show, as always. What are your thoughts on Jatius Geer joining South Carolina's football program? What do you think he brings to the table for the Gamecocks? Where do you think he's going to fit in Clayton White's defense, and more specifically, that defensive line rotation? And lastly, what are your thoughts on South Carolina's upcoming baseball series against the Arkansas Razorbacks? Do you think they'll manage to bounce back this week? Let me know your thoughts on all of those topics down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube. Or if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app, you can shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @alion_SC. Again, if you haven't already seen it before, the Locked On Gamecocks podcast is also now on Facebook. So if you frequently go on Facebook, you can go over there, just type in Locked On Gamecocks, and you can give us a follow there if you would like to, so that you don't miss out on future alerts and notifications on future shows from the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. But again, that does it for me on today's show. Have a great rest of your Friday and a fantastic weekend. And a quick shout out. Congratulations to South Carolina's softball team. Been killing it in the SEC tournament, moving on to the semifinals to face the Auburn Tigers. Only the second time in SEC tournament history that a double-digit seed has made it to the semifinals. Really big accomplishment for that ball club after everything they've been through over the last 18, 19 months or so. So congrats to them, and good luck on hopefully a long run in postseason play. I'll catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.